A crowned man of 26 kneels beside a fragile 15-year-old girl who still calls him uncle. Their bridal kiss seals not only a marriage, but a genetic time bomb that has already twisted jaws and crippled spines across Europe. 4 pregnancies, 3 coffins, and 1 dying whisper later. The girl bride vanishes into the vaults of Vienna, leaving an empire to reckon with a love story written in its own diseased blood. When Leopold I of Austria first laid eyes on his bride-to-be, he was looking at a mirror of his own bloodline stretched back through centuries of calculated unions. Margaret Theresa wasn't just his niece. She was his double niece, born from a web of Habsburg marriages so tightly woven that the family tree resembled a twisted rope more than branching wood. Her father, Philip IV of Spain, was Leopold's half-brother. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, was Leopold's full sister. This made the young emperor simultaneously the girl's paternal uncle and maternal uncle, a genetic convergence that would have horrified modern science but thrilled 17th-century diplomats. The match had been orchestrated before Margaret could even walk. Spanish Habsburg territories stretched from the Netherlands to Naples, from Milan to the Americas, but the dynasty's grip was weakening. Philip IV desperately needed to bind the Austrian and Spanish branches of his house into an unbreakable alliance. What better cement than the mingled blood of his own daughter and his Habsburg nephew? The marriage contract, signed when Margaret was barely 6 years old, promised not just political unity, but genetic concentration. Every Habsburg trait, every Habsburg flaw, doubled and redoubled in their future offspring. By the time Leopold rode into Vienna's Hofburg Palace to claim his child bride, the Habsburg bloodline had already been circling itself for 200 years. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, and the family's distinctive features grew more pronounced with each generation. The emperor himself bore the telltale signs: a jutting lower jaw, a long nose, and the pale, almost translucent skin that marked pure Habsburg breeding. Now he would pass these traits to children born of his own sister's daughter, sealing the dynasty's fate in a union that was as much biological experiment as political necessity. The winter evening of December 5th, 1666, cast long shadows through the Gothic corridors of the Hofburg Palace, as Vienna prepared for an imperial wedding that would echo through history's darkest chapters. Flickering candlelight danced across stone walls adorned with Habsburg eagles, their golden eyes seeming to witness the union of blood already too familiar with itself. The bride, Margaret Theresa, stood barely 5 feet tall in her elaborate Spanish gown, her childish features accentuated by the heavy cosmetics applied to make her appear older than her 15 years. Courtiers whispered behind jeweled fans about how she still spoke in the high, lilting voice of a girl who had never known anything but palace walls and formal protocol. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of Habsburg pomp. Incense, thick as fog, Latin prayers echoing from vaulted ceilings, and the bride's trembling hands as she exchanged vows with the man she had been taught to address as Your Imperial Majesty since childhood. But it was the wedding night that would haunt the palace's collective memory, as Leopold led his child bride through corridors lined with portraits of their shared ancestors. Servants later reported hearing her voice through the heavy wooden doors of the imperial bedchamber. Not the passionate whispers of new love, but the confused murmur of a girl still calling her husband uncle in the darkness. The emperor, known for his rigid piety and mechanical devotion to duty, approached his marital obligations with the same methodical precision he applied to governing an empire. Court physicians had already examined the young empress and pronounced her adequately formed for childbearing, though they noted her narrow hips and delicate frame with barely concealed concern. The wedding night became a clinical transaction, dynasty demanding its due from a girl who still played with dolls in her private chambers. By dawn the deed was done, and Margaret Theresa's transformation from Spanish infanta to Habsburg broodmare was complete. The empire had its air-making machine, wrapped in silk and perfume with rosewater, but trembling with the weight of a future she could never have imagined. The portrait galleries of every Habsburg palace told the same grotesque story, a dynasty slowly consuming itself through centuries of deliberate inbreeding, each generation more twisted than the last. The infamous Habsburg jaw, known to court physicians as mandibular prognathism, had grown more pronounced with each calculated union between cousins, uncles, and nieces. What began as a slight underbite in early Habsburg rulers had evolved into a deformity so severe that later family members could barely chew their food, their protruding lower jaws creating gaps that made speech slurred and eating a laborious process. Charles II of Spain, Margaret Theresa's half-brother, embodied the dynasty's genetic collapse. His jaw jutted so far forward that his tongue hung perpetually from his mouth, and his mental capacity never developed beyond that of a child. He was the product of 11 generations of uncle-niece and cousin marriages, his family tree so tangled that his coefficient of inbreeding exceeded that of children born to full siblings. Court records from Madrid describe him as unable to walk until age 4, speak clearly until age 8, and he would die at 38 without producing a single heir, despite 2 marriages. The medical horrors extended far beyond facial deformities. Habsburg family records, meticulously maintained by court physicians, revealed a catalog of genetic disasters. Epilepsy struck 1 in 3 family members. Infertility plagued both men and women, and spinal deformities created hunched backs, hidden beneath elaborate court dress. The dynasty's children died in infancy at rates that shocked even 17th-century medicine. Of the 34 children born to Habsburg rulers between 1550 and 1700, only 18 survived to adulthood. Portraits commissioned by the family became exercises in creative deception. Court painters learned to position their subjects at carefully calculated angles, hiding curved spines behind flowing robes and minimizing protruding jaws through strategic lighting and perspective. The famous Velázquez paintings of the Spanish Habsburgs transformed genetic catastrophes into regal dignity, but X-rays of these canvases reveal the truth. Layers of paint carefully applied to mask the reality of what 2 centuries of concentrated breeding had created. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a family trait, it was a warning, written in bone and blood, a testament to what happens when power believes it can improve upon nature through its own twisted logic. Margaret Theresa's daily existence as empress unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance, every gesture dictated by the rigid Spanish etiquette that had governed her childhood and now defined her imperial role. Each morning she was laced into stays so tight that courtiers reported seeing her wince as the whalebone pressed against her ribs, the corset designed to create an illusion of maturity on her still developing frame. Her ladies-in-waiting, imported from Madrid to maintain the familiar rituals of her youth, dressed her in layers of silk and brocade that transformed the slight girl into a living monument to Habsburg majesty. The empress spoke Spanish with the lilting accent of Castile, her native tongue echoing strangely through the German-speaking corridors of the Hofburg. Court observers noted how she would lapse into rapid Spanish when nervous or confused, her voice rising to an almost childish pitch that reminded everyone of her true age. During formal audiences, she sat perfectly still on her throne, hands folded in her lap, exactly as she had been taught. But her eyes would dart nervously between the stern faces of Austrian courtiers, who remained strangers despite months of marriage. Protocol demanded that she address her husband as Your Imperial Majesty in public, but servants reported that in private moments the old habits of childhood persisted. She would unconsciously reach for his hand during morning prayers, the gesture of a niece seeking comfort from a familiar uncle, then catch herself and withdraw with the practiced grace of an empress who had learned to suppress her natural instincts. Her Spanish confessor, Father Martinez, noted in his private letters how she would weep during confession, not from guilt, but from a loneliness that seemed to emanate from her very bones. The imperial couple's evening meals became studies in careful choreography, Margaret picking delicately at her food, while Leopold watched with the calculating gaze of a man monitoring an investment. She had been trained to eat like a Spanish princess, taking tiny bites and speaking only when addressed, but the rich Austrian cuisine often left her feeling nauseous. Court physicians attributed her frequent stomach ailments to the stress of adjustment, but whispered among themselves about the deeper implications of a body, still growing, being forced to perform the duties of an adult woman. The porcelain doll had been placed on her marble throne, beautiful and fragile, waiting for the inevitable moment when the weight of empire would finally shatter her delicate form. The spring of 1667 brought whispers of hope through the Hofburg Palace, as Margaret Theresa's monthly bleeding ceased, and court physicians confirmed what the empire desperately needed. An heir grew in the young empress's womb. At barely 16, her body had barely finished its own development. When pregnancy demanded new transformations, the Spanish court dress was gradually loosened, then replaced entirely with flowing gowns designed to accommodate her expanding belly. But even these could not hide how her slight frame seemed overwhelmed by the burden it carried. Leopold received the news with characteristic stoicism, immediately ordering prayers of thanksgiving in every church across his domains, while privately consulting with his most trusted physicians about the risks. The court's medical records, preserved in the imperial archives, reveal a growing concern about Margaret's narrow pelvis, a trait that had become increasingly common among Habsburg women as generations of inbreeding concentrated their bone structure into ever more delicate forms. Dr. Johann Franciscus, the court's chief physician, noted in his private observations that the empress's hips measured barely 18 inches across, significantly narrower than ideal for safe childbirth. The pregnancy progressed with alarming difficulty. Margaret suffered from constant nausea that left her unable to keep down even the lightest meals, her already pale complexion becoming almost translucent. Court ladies reported finding her collapsed in her chambers, clutching her swollen belly and whispering Spanish prayers through tears of exhaustion. The Habsburg genetic legacy was already asserting itself. The child within her seemed to be consuming its mother from the inside, demanding nutrients from a body that had little to spare. Labor began prematurely on a cold February morning in 1668, 7 months after conception. The screams that echoed from the imperial birthing chamber sent servants scurrying through corridors, crossing themselves and murmuring prayers. For 18 hours Margaret Theresa fought to bring forth the empire's heir, her slight body racked with contractions that seemed to tear her apart. When the child finally emerged, a son, perfectly formed but far too small. He drew only a few gasping breaths before falling silent forever. The infant prince was buried without ceremony in the Habsburg crypt, his tiny coffin inscribed simply with the date of his birth and death. No name was recorded, no official mourning declared. The empire's first attempt at securing its future had ended in a grave barely larger than a jewelry box, while above in the palace a 16-year-old girl lay bleeding and broken, already being prepared for the next attempt at dynasty building that would surely come. 2 years of careful medical attention and cautious hope culminated in the autumn of 1669, when Margaret Theresa again found herself carrying the empire's future in her increasingly fragile womb. This second pregnancy proceeded with marginally better fortune. Court physicians noted that she had gained weight since her first tragic labor, her hips had widened slightly with maturity, and the nausea that had plagued her earlier pregnancy was less severe. Leopold allowed himself cautious optimism, commissioning a new cradle of silver and ivory, while his wife endured the familiar routine of loosened stays and constant medical supervision. On January 2, 1670, after a labor that lasted nearly a full day, Margaret Theresa delivered a living daughter who drew breath and cried with the lusty voice of survival. The infant was christened Maria Antonia, and for the first time since her wedding night, Genuine joy flickered across the young empress's face as she held her child. The court erupted in celebration. Cannons fired from the palace ramparts, Te Deum echoed from every church in Vienna, and diplomatic messengers rode across Europe carrying news that the Habsburg line would continue through this precious girl. But the physician's private reports told a darker story. Margaret Theresa had developed a persistent fever during the final weeks of pregnancy that refused to break even after delivery. Her body, already depleted by the demands of carrying one child to term after losing another, seemed unable to recover from the trauma of birth. Dr. Franciscus documented alarming symptoms in his encrypted notes: bone pain that left the empress unable to walk some mornings, a persistent cough that occasionally brought up flecks of blood, and a listlessness that no amount of rest could cure. The baby herself, while alive and apparently healthy, bore subtle signs of her concentrated heritage. Her jaw, even in infancy, showed the telltale Habsburg protrusion, and her limbs seemed unusually long for her tiny body. Court portraitists were instructed to emphasize her rosebud mouth and bright eyes, while minimizing the familial features that already marked her as another link in the dynasty's genetic chain. Maria Antonia would grow up to marry the Elector of Bavaria, carrying her Habsburg blood into yet another royal line. But she would die at 29, her brief life another casualty of the family's obsession with keeping power within its own twisted bloodline. As Margaret Theresa held her surviving daughter, the physicians exchanged worried glances. The empress had given the empire its heir, but the cost to her own body was becoming impossible to ignore. The skeletal pain, the recurring fevers, the way her spine seemed to curve more noticeably with each passing month. These were not the normal after-effects of childbirth, but the accumulated damage of a body never meant to bear the concentrated weight of Habsburg genetics. The cruel mathematics of dynasty demanded more, and Margaret Theresa's body, still recovering from Maria Antonia's birth, was soon expected to produce another heir. By late 1670, the empress was pregnant for the third time, her frail form once again swelling with the empire's hopes. Court observers noted how differently she carried this child. Her movements had become labored, her spine visibly curved beneath the elaborate gowns designed to hide her condition, and her face bore the hollow-eyed expression of someone whose body was slowly surrendering to forces beyond her control. The pregnancy progressed with ominous signs. Margaret suffered from dizzy spells that left her clinging to furniture, her hands shaking so violently that she could barely hold a wine cup during formal dinners. The bone pain that had plagued her since Maria Antonia's birth intensified, radiating through her back and legs with such severity that she often required assistance to walk. Dr. Franciscus's medical notes, written in Latin to shield their contents from casual observers, described a patient whose skeleton seemed to be dissolving from within, her ribs becoming so brittle that tight lacing was no longer possible. The stillborn daughter arrived in March 1671, perfectly formed but lifeless, her tiny Habsburg features already showing the family's characteristic jaw. The birth was mercifully swift, but the aftermath proved devastating. Margaret Theresa hemorrhaged for days, her body's ability to heal itself seemingly exhausted by the repeated demands of pregnancy and loss. The infant was buried in the imperial crypt beside her unnamed brother, another small coffin added to the growing collection of Habsburg failures. Before the empress had fully recovered from this loss, the dynastic machinery was already turning toward the next attempt. Leopold's advisers reminded him that time was running short. Margaret was approaching 21, already considered advanced age for childbearing, in an era when women often died in their 20s. The emperor, his face a mask of imperial duty, nodded grimly and resumed his methodical visits to his wife's bedchamber. The fourth pregnancy began in early 1672, and this time even the court's most optimistic physicians could not hide their alarm. Margaret Theresa's body had become a fragile shell, her skin so pale it seemed translucent, her movements so cautious that she appeared to be walking on broken glass. The stillborn son who emerged that winter was the final proof that the Habsburg bloodline had reached its biological limits. As the tiny prince was carried to the crypt, court observers noted that the empress wept not with grief, but with what appeared to be relief. The terrible cycle of hope and death had finally broken her spirit completely. Leopold stood beside the burial vault, his jaw set in grim determination, already calculating whether his shattered wife could survive one more attempt at securing the dynasty's future. The official autopsy report of Empress Margaret Theresa, conducted by court physician Dr. Johann Franciscus on March 12, 1673, read like a medical catalog of genetic collapse. The 21-year-old empress, who had entered marriage as a delicate but seemingly healthy girl, was found to have the skeletal structure of a woman decades older. Her spine curved in an S shape so severe that her ribs had compressed her lungs, explaining the persistent breathing difficulties that had plagued her final months. The vertebrae themselves showed signs of premature deterioration, crumbling at the edges like ancient parchment. Dr. Franciscus's scalpel revealed bones so porous and brittle that they cracked under the gentlest pressure. In his private notes, encrypted in a mixture of Latin and German, he compared the empress's skeleton to porous chalk that has been left too long in damp air. Her pelvis, already narrow from birth, had been further damaged by repeated pregnancies, with stress fractures radiating from the points where her body had been forced to accommodate births it was never designed to handle. The uterus itself bore the scarred evidence of multiple miscarriages, its walls so thin and damaged that successful pregnancy had become a biological impossibility. The Habsburg jaw that had marked her lineage was found to be connected to deeper structural problems throughout her skull. Her teeth, worn down from the misalignment that made proper chewing difficult, showed evidence of chronic infection that had likely contributed to her recurring fevers. The cranial measurements revealed the characteristic Habsburg features: the elongated face, the protruding mandible, the narrow nasal passages that had made breathing a conscious effort rather than an automatic function. Most damning of all was the condition of her major organs. The heart, enlarged from the strain of pumping blood through a body under constant stress, showed signs of premature failure. Her liver, responsible for processing the heavy mercury treatments prescribed for her hysteria, was spotted, with the telltale signs of toxic damage. The lungs, compressed by her curved spine and damaged by repeated respiratory infections, had barely functioned during her final weeks. Dr. Franciscus concluded his report with a single, devastating observation, written in his personal cipher. "The body before me represents not the natural death of a young woman, but the inevitable conclusion of a bloodline that has consumed itself." The empress had not simply died. She had been systematically destroyed by the genetic legacy of 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding, her body unable to sustain the concentrated burden of her own ancestry. The autopsy revealed the true cost of keeping power within the family. Margaret Theresa had been sacrificed not just to dynasty, but to the biological mathematics of a bloodline that had finally reached its mathematical limit. The death of Margaret Theresa set in motion a cascade of political catastrophe that would reshape the map of Europe for generations. Her surviving daughter, Maria Antonia, inherited not just her mother's fragile constitution, but also the most contested throne in European history, the Spanish crown that had been promised to the Habsburg bloodline through centuries of carefully orchestrated marriages. When Charles II of Spain, Margaret's half-brother and the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, died childless in 1700, Maria Antonia's claim to the throne became the spark that ignited the War of Spanish Succession. Leopold I's desperate gamble to secure Habsburg dominance through concentrated breeding had instead created a succession crisis that would consume Europe in warfare for 13 years. The very genetic weakness that had killed his young wife now threatened to tear apart the continental balance of power. Louis XIV of France, sensing an opportunity to expand his territories, pressed his own grandson's claim to the Spanish throne, arguing that the Habsburg line had proven itself biologically bankrupt and politically dangerous. The war that followed was fought not just over territory, but over the principle that had destroyed Margaret Theresa: whether royal bloodlines could continue to marry within themselves without destroying the very foundations of dynastic power. The Battle of Blenheim, the Siege of Gibraltar, and countless other conflicts across Europe were all, in essence, fighting over the consequences of that December night in 1666, when a 26-year-old emperor had married his 15-year-old niece. Maria Antonia herself became a tragic footnote to her mother's story. Married to Maximilian II, Emmanuel of Bavaria, she bore children who carried the Habsburg genetic legacy into yet another royal house. Her son, Joseph Ferdinand, was briefly considered as a compromise candidate for the Spanish throne, but he died at age 6, another victim of the concentrated bloodline that had claimed his grandmother. Maria Antonia followed him to the grave at 29, her death eerily mirroring her mother's pattern of early physical collapse. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 finally ended the war by formally splitting the Spanish Empire and establishing the principle that the same person could never rule both Spain and Austria simultaneously. This diplomatic solution was, in essence, an admission that the Habsburg strategy of genetic concentration had failed so catastrophically that it threatened the stability of the entire European order. The empire that Margaret Theresa had died trying to preserve was dismantled by the very weakness her death had revealed. Leopold's quest for a pure Habsburg heir had instead produced a daughter whose contested inheritance would cost Europe over 1 million lives and fundamentally alter the balance of continental power. The genetic time bomb that had destroyed his young wife exploded across battlefields from Italy to the Low Countries, proving that the biological mathematics of inbreeding carried political consequences that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could contain. The portrait galleries of the Hofburg Palace became monuments to the most sophisticated propaganda campaign in European history, where skilled artists transformed genetic catastrophe into royal dignity through careful manipulation of brush and canvas. The court painters who immortalized Margaret Theresa knew exactly what they were being asked to hide. Her portraits show a serene young woman with delicate features and perfect posture, her Habsburg jaw minimized to a barely perceptible underbite, her curved spine concealed beneath flowing silk gowns that created the illusion of regal bearing. Diego Velázquez's protégé, Juan Bautista Martínez del Mazo, painted the Empress in her wedding dress with such skill that viewers saw only imperial majesty, not the frightened child who had trembled through her marriage ceremony. The artistic techniques were revolutionary. Strategic lighting that cast shadows across protruding jaws, carefully angled poses that hid spinal deformities, and flowing fabrics that disguised the brittle fragility of Habsburg bones. Each portrait was a masterpiece of deception, presenting the public face of a dynasty while burying the medical reality beneath layers of idealized beauty. The contrast between these painted fantasies and the medical records preserved in the imperial archives reveals the true scope of the cover-up. While court artists depicted Margaret Theresa as a radiant young empress gracefully fulfilling her dynastic duties, Dr. Franciscus's encrypted medical notes described a patient whose body was systematically failing under the weight of concentrated genetics. The same woman who appeared serene and healthy in oils and watercolors was privately documented as suffering from chronic pain, respiratory distress, and skeletal deterioration that made simple movements an ordeal. Modern X-ray analysis of Habsburg portraits has revealed the sophisticated methods artists used to disguise genetic deformities. Layers of paint were carefully applied to reshape jawlines, minimize facial asymmetries, and create the illusion of proper bone structure. The royal portraitists became skilled in what amounted to early plastic surgery through pigment, reconstructing faces that genetics had distorted beyond recognition. These paintings weren't just art. They were medical propaganda designed to convince Europe that the Habsburg bloodline remained vigorous and healthy. The artistic deception extended beyond individual portraits to the very concept of royal representation itself. The Habsburg court pioneered the use of idealized imagery to mask biological reality, creating a visual language that other European monarchies would adopt for centuries. The tragedy of Margaret Theresa wasn't just that she died young, but that her death was hidden behind such beautiful lies that the true cost of dynastic inbreeding remained invisible to the very people who might have prevented it. Art became complicit in the dynasty's self-destruction, transforming victims into icons while the genetic time bomb continued to tick away in royal nurseries across Europe. The story of Margaret Theresa stands as one of history's most damning indictments of a system that treated human beings as breeding stock in service of political ambition. Her life, brief and tragic, illuminates the fundamental cruelty inherent in dynastic marriages where children become pawns in games of continental power, their bodies sacrificed to maintain the fiction that bloodlines can be purified through careful calculation rather than natural selection. The 15-year-old girl who whispered "uncle" on her wedding night was not just a victim of one man's desire, but of an entire civilization that had convinced itself that political necessity justified any human cost. The Habsburg obsession with genetic purity reveals the deeper pathology of absolute power, the belief that royal blood could be concentrated and refined like precious metal, that human genetics could be manipulated to serve imperial ambitions without consequence. Margaret Theresa's 4 pregnancies, 3 dead children, and ultimate death at 21 were not tragic accidents, but the inevitable mathematical result of a dynasty that had spent 2 centuries breeding itself into biological collapse. Her suffering was not incidental to Habsburg policy. It was the policy's logical conclusion. The medical records that documented her deterioration read like a case study in systemic abuse disguised as dynastic duty. Each pregnancy that weakened her bones, each stillbirth that damaged her body, each fever that brought her closer to death was carefully recorded by court physicians who understood exactly what they were witnessing but were powerless to prevent it. The empire's need for heirs overrode any consideration of the young woman whose body was being systematically destroyed to produce them. Perhaps most chilling is how completely the system normalized this exploitation. Margaret Theresa's death was mourned not as the loss of a young woman whose life had been cut short by the demands placed upon her, but as a dynastic setback that required immediate replacement. Leopold was already considering his next marriage before his wife was cold in her tomb, the imperial machinery grinding forward without pause to consider whether the cost in human suffering might be too high to justify the political benefits. The true lesson of Margaret Theresa's story is not about the dangers of inbreeding, though those dangers were catastrophically real. It is about what happens when societies organize themselves around the principle that some human lives matter less than others, that children can be sacrificed to maintain systems of power, and that political necessity can justify any cruelty. Her whispered "uncle" in the darkness of her wedding chamber echoes across centuries as a reminder that behind every dynasty's glory lies a foundation built on the broken bodies of those deemed expendable in service of empire.